A long time ago, the island of Sodor consisted of several smaller railways that were disconnected from one another. Eventually, though, plans were made to have them all joined together as one, creating what we now know as the Fat Controllers Railway. This change included many developments, digging tunnels, forming new stations, and one in particular, constructing a huge viaduct across the valley, which still stands today. To assist with all of this, a tank engine was brought in from the mainland to work on one of the smaller railways. This engine was unusual. It was a newly built prototype, one of a kind. As it was rushed to the island, it never got a name, a number, or even a proper paint job. It still wore its grey undercoat, which wore off very easily. The engine had nothing, and eventually picked up the name Zero. Now, Zero wasn't a bad sort, from what workers and engines have said. In fact, it was rather friendly, and always eager to please. It was truly a shame, then, that it wasn't a very successful engine. Being an early prototype, Zero came with many faults in its design that greatly hindered its performance. You know how Henry used to be before his rebuild at Crew? It was like that, except it wasn't a small firebox. Rather, Zero lacked any real pulling power. It could pull trains and shunt trucks, but struggled greatly with heavier loads. For many of the other engines on the railway, it was seen as a great source for teasing and bullying. Zero would often find itself in a corner as endless arrays of insults were thrown at it. "You keep to the sidings, weakling," the engines said. "Make way for the proper engines." Zero never had the strength to fight back. It tried its best to be useful, but the heavy workloads and constant berating from others made life harder than it already was. There were a small handful of engines that stood by Zero's side and gave as much support as possible, though it seemed to do no good. Then, one fateful night, everything changed. There was an evening passenger train bound for the last station on the line, just before the valley where the viaduct was still being built. However, the engine scheduled for the train had broken down, and no one else was available. Except for Zero. There was much concern from many as Zero backed onto the coaches. The engine itself was determined. No matter the strain, it would ensure the train would reach the other end of the line. Once the guard's whistle had sounded, Zero huffed and puffed out of the station. Its cheeks were already red when the last coach left the platform, but it carried on regardless. The train wasn't going too slow, but for Zero, it wasn't enough. He tried even harder, and eventually reached a more favourable pace. By that point, however, they were far behind schedule. Not far from the station, they approached a loop where a goods train sat waiting. The engine stared in disbelief at Zero and scowled at it. "Pathetic," it wheezed. "To think that you believe you could be worthy of a train like that. Do yourself a favour, weakling. Throw yourself off the line when you're done. We don't need engines like you." Now, no one is certain what happened next. Zero's driver said the regulator just stopped working, and they couldn't slow down. The goods engine claimed that when the insult was thrown, Zero looked furious, almost deranged. Whatever the reason, the train began going faster and faster. The engine's wheels blurred, and the coaches rattled violently. The last station came into view, but the train merely sped past, startling all who stood on the platform Once they realised this, the guards slammed on the brakes in the van. The only result was loud screeching wheels, firing huge sparks in all directions. The driver and fireman fought for control, pressing hard on the regulator and brakes. All attempts were futile. Zero didn't slow. In fact, it seemed to be going even faster. It quickly sunk in where they were heading. They were now on a long stretch of line, and at the end, the valley. The valley came closer and closer. Workmen who were on a night shift ran to safety. The driver only saw one option. He grabbed a pole and thrusted it into the fireman's hands. "Quick, get out there and uncouple the train!" Any fear the fireman had was ignored, as he clambered out the cab and waddled on the running board. Holding onto the bunker, he reached down and tried to grab the chain with the pole. The swaying engine nearly had him lose his footing several times, and it seemed impossible to pull the chain. But he tried, over and over and over again. And then, "Got it!" he shouted as he lifted the chain off the hook. The coaches began trailing behind, and the crew leapt off the engine. As for Zero, the passenger train thankfully stopped before reaching the end. Not one human was harmed. Rightfully so, the driver and fireman were dubbed heroes of the railway. They showed remarkable bravery in such a dire situation. There wasn't much care for their engine though. The remains were fished out and left in the yard. Some parts were salvageable, but otherwise, Zero was lost. No one seemed to really care. By that point, some other engines had already been bought or loaned. Some say that every year, on the date of the accident, it runs again, as a warning to others. And some even claim to have seen it, plunging into the gap, shrieking like a lost soul.